Welcome to Tower Talk Business Radio, where we bring you conversations with the top business minds on Long Island and around the nation every week. Featuring expert consultants and small business owners who have found success but are also willing to share their top tips, failures, and give gritty, matter-of-fact advice based on their firsthand experience. Now, let's get down to business on Tower Talk Business Radio on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Hello and welcome to Tower Talk Business Radio. My name is Ray Schwetz, AVP of Business Banking at Giovia Financial Credit Union. We bring you weekly advice, tips, tools, and services and stories. Plus, we interview top leaders in their industry. And the more you read, the better. I've challenged myself to read at least 2 books a month. My favorite read so far this year is Julian David Stone's It's Alive. It's a historical fiction novel chronicling a short but pivotal time period in Hollywood where Universal Studios transitioned from making kind of formulaic pictures to more prestige horror films that propelled them into legend. So here with me today is Julian David Stone. Julian, welcome to the show today.
Great to be here. Thanks so much for having me on.
People know that I am a big horror buff and I love old films, and the Universal films in particular mean so much to me. You know, I was a monster kid. Sounds like you were as well.
Oh, no question. I was there in the early 70s building my Aurora model kits and watching the classic horror films on television. Absolutely.
Yep. That was the stuff. That was just awesome. And well, before we jump into your wonderful novel, It's Alive, please tell us just a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I live in Los Angeles. I have been working in Hollywood, for coming up on 35 years. I initially was a screenwriter for many years, and then I transitioned into writing novels. And yeah, that's kind of pretty much where I'm at. It's been writing pretty steadily for about, 30 some odd years now.
Wow. Your background is it definitely shows that you have a creative impulse, and you've expressed it through various mediums. So why don't you tell us a little bit about some of those previous projects?
Sure. So when I was discovering, I was first a filmmaker. I remember when I got out of college in my early 20s and I started meeting my first agents. And ironically, I would say, well, the one thing I'm not interested in, or I'm the least interested in, is writing. And of course, that becomes my entire career since pretty much the age of 23. But previously, before realizing that that's where I was really going to excel, I was very interested in the filmmaking aspect of movie making and photography. And I had a previous career in my teens as a rock and roll photographer, which I have a different book that is all the photos that I took as a teenager because I was smuggling my equipment into concerts. And it was a whole part of my life that I literally put away for over 30 years. And then through various unusual circumstances, it all kind of bubbled to the surface. And that's a book of my work that came out just a few years ago, chronicling that time, because I reached a point when I was in college. I was in college studying filmmaking, but at the same time, my rock and roll photography career was exploding. And I literally was, getting calls by different magazines to go shoot concerts. And meanwhile, I'm like, but I'm in college to study film. And I had to make a choice. So I took the filmmaking path, which then ultimately led me to writing. So yes, as you said, a lot of different creative avenues, all kind of centered around the same thing, which I sort of think of as visual storytelling, which then became written storytelling.
Yeah, it sounds like that would make a great book just on its own.
Yeah, no, if I can plug the other book, No Cameras Allowed, my career as an outlaw rock and roll photographer, it's been very gratifying because it's not just the rock and roll photos, it's all the stories of, one, what I was going through as I was evolving as a photographer, and two, mostly it's a lot of fun stuff of sort of being a precocious teenager and sneaking equipment into shows and getting chased by roadies and all kinds of stuff like that.
That's awesome. Now, do you see yourself primarily as a storyteller?
Yes, that's kind of what it sort of has taken me my whole life to sort of distill it down to. It was the storytelling that I was going for, even in the way that going back to the beginning of photographing the concerts, I was looking for a story there, and then it all literally turned into the most purest form, which is writing.
Now, your last book, not It's Alive, but your last book about Justice Girl is being developed into a series. Is that correct?
That is correct. That's been going on for a very, very long time. So, in all honesty, I'm not too active or not sure how active it is at the moment, but it bubbles up every once in a while. I wrote it about 7 or 8 years ago, and it's called The Strange Birth, Short Life, and Sudden Death of Justice Girl. And it tells the story of kind of almost a lost chapter and a lost art in America primarily, which is television until the late 1950s was all live. There was no videotape. So you had this amazing period from the end of World War II up until about 57, 58, when videotape is invented, where these incredible productions were being done, very complicated, stagings of big plays and big stories and big scripts, all of it done live, mostly out of New York City, out of studios there. And this tells the story of a writer in that period who accidentally creates this character who becomes a justice girl, which becomes an overnight sensation, and everything that he deals with suddenly having this very popular character and battling with networks and censorship and all of the stuff that went on then.
Oh, that's incredible. It's so funny, and it is a lost art, because I was explaining to my kids, I was watching The Honeymooners, around New Year's, as a lot of us New Yorkers do. And they were watching it, and they're going, wow, people are laughing with it, and it's not just a laugh track. And I explained to them, they used to film this stuff live. They're doing this live. Which is just incredible.
The Honeymooners was actually one of the first shows where Gleason figured out how to simultaneously film it while it was going out live. That's why we're so lucky to have those exist all these years later, because there was a cruder form called a kinescope where they would put a camera in front of a screen and film it, that some things exist from, but Gleason, to his credit, figured out, let's film these simultaneously, and that's why we're so blessed to have those amazing shows all these years later.
Yeah, agreed. Thankfully, they did that, because the kinescope, as you said, it is very crude. I have a few of those. I'm a big Zachary fan, and I'm sure you are as well.
Yeah.
But so some of those kinescopes for Zachary are pretty beat up. Now, for the uninitiated, how would you explain It's Alive and what it's about?
Sure. It's Alive tells the story of the days leading up to the beginning of production on the 1931 classic Frankenstein. And it tells the story because everybody, knows today that it was Boris Karloff who played the monster, but that almost wasn't the case. There was a lot of back and forth between whether it was going to be Boris Karloff or Bela Lugosi, who had become previously famous from Dracula. And at the center of it was a young kid, for lack of a better term, named Carl Laemmle Jr. or Junior Laemmle, who at the age of 23 was running Universal Studios. And it tells the story from the point of view of those three characters with the back and forth of trying to get this film made, because it's a pivotal moment in all three of their lives. Karloff, going into the making of Frankenstein, is a complete unknown. He'd made over 80 movies in Hollywood, but was 2 days at one studio, 2 days at another studio, maybe a week if he was lucky. He was very much a struggling actor, for lack of a better term. Lugosi, of course, has become a big star off of Dracula at this moment in time. And then you have Junior Laemmle, this kid running a movie studio who, against everybody's advice, wants to make these films. And, that's the story. It's the back and forth between all of them and what they have, on the line. And they all come out of this experience with their lives going in completely different trajectories. It's a pivotal moment, as you said, for all of them.
Yeah, and I guess that's why you kind of zeroed on that time period, because that was one of my questions. I was really why there's so much history regarding this film and Universal Studios, but what was it about these specific days that really appealed to you?
Well, it was just that it was, when, we sort of touched on this before when we were talking, I was a monster kid back in the 70s. And then, I loved the films, but then, I kind of drifted away from him as you discover girls and, and other things in your life. And then I rediscovered the films about, in the late 90s and early aughts as an adult. And when I saw them as an adult, of course, just seeing the films, I saw so much more in them than I had missed as a kid. But then I got really interested in what went on behind the scenes. And at this point, I was a writer. So I also was like, oh, maybe there'll be some story I want to tell in all this. And I started taking a deeper dive. And when I landed on Carl Laemmle Jr. or Junior Laemmle being the catalyst for this entire thing, and he was 23 when he chose to make Frankenstein, but he was 21 when he was put in charge of the studio. And I just couldn't get out of my head that there was a 21-year-old running a movie studio. And the more I did the deeper dive into him, and then you're looking for where's the moment, that you can most tell the story. And when I found out about this back and forth right before the making of Frankenstein, as to who was going to play the part, I just said, that's the story, because you have this amazing character in Carl Laemmle Jr. running a movie studio, but you also have, you have Bela Lugosi, and I didn't know he was going to be Frankenstein originally. It was all sort of new information, and a great way to tell it was through this moment in time, because the decision apparently went right up to the last minute as to who it would be.
That, for me, was what was pretty fantastic. Well, among other things, reading the book was just that I know the outcome because I'm a fan, but I have to tell you, it was a page turner. There was a lot of suspense.
Well, yeah, that I was very, that's been a comment everybody has said, and I'm really proud of that. And it kind of was. I mean, even though we know the outcome, it really did, my book is historical fiction, but throughout it, particularly in the beginning and then a little bit at the end, there's quotes, from the newspapers. Those are all real. There is no mention of Boris Karloff playing the role of the monster until after they start shooting the film. That's how it came down, to the last minute. And then I also quote, there's a very famous letter from James Whale, the director of Frankenstein, to Colin Clive, who plays Dr. Frankenstein, as he's he's arrived in America, making his way to Universal to shoot the movie. And this letter is waiting for him in New York with a copy of the Frankenstein script. And this is just 2 weeks, basically, from the beginning of shooting. And in this letter, James Whale says it's either going to be Bela Lugosi or Boris Karloff as the monster. So there you have it, just weeks before. They're still trying to figure out who's going to star in this role that is so famous now.
You are listening to Tara Talk Business Radio on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm Ray Schwetz, and we're here today with Julian David Stone, the author of It's Alive. So, Julian, it's Hollywood 1931. Your novel, It's Alive, it transports us back into that world. Now, what kind of research did you do to achieve this?
A lot. And in fact, that was kind of a real epiphany while I was writing it. I'd been working on it over a long period of time. Part of it got interrupted by the rock and roll book because, like I said, that kind of came out of nowhere that I ended up doing that book. So I'd already started working on this. But when I really went back to this full time and I finished a first draft and of It's Alive, it wasn't quite working. And I had a kind of an epiphany, and I sort of I pulled back my view because I realized what I was doing wrong. I had delved too deeply just into the world of the monsters and Universal. And I said, no, I need to go back and look at everything of what was going on in Hollywood in 1931. And so I read the entire year's worth of Photoplay magazine that year. I read the Hollywood Reporter for that year. I couldn't read every newspaper, but I read a lot of LA Times because, it's a company town. And I wanted to get the sense of what was going on. And that's when the story got so much better. And like you said, people, again, have had that same comment about really feeling like you're in that year. That came because I immersed myself in that year. And one of my favorite things to do is I much prefer reading history in the moment, meaning not a book written 20 years later, but reading Photoplay magazine from 1931, written by somebody, probably days before it went to press, or the daily newspapers or the Hollywood Reporter, because, nobody's, obviously writing with the standpoint, Frankenstein could have been a flop and that's the end of it. So it's just another production coming down the line. And there's the usual debates about, is this a smart film to make? Isn't that, it's all caught up in its moment. And that's the stuff I love.
Oh, yeah. That was definitely, the juice was worth the squeeze there. I got to tell you, that was pretty fantastic.
I happen to love research. I kind of have the opposite problem where I once I get going, I do reach a point where I go, okay, you got to stop the research. You need to start writing the book because it's so fun and it can go on forever. You can just go and go and go. I
also have to say that one of the things that was very fascinating to me was that although I've read a lot about the monster films, I've read a lot about the stars, we've seen documentaries, there's so much information that's out there, it almost feels like it's impossible to come up with something new. And what I have to say you really did so effectively was you brought out the personalities. You extrapolated the best of the personalities from Boris Karloff, from Junior, from Bela Lugosi, and you captured a lot of their activities. So, how did you really bring that out? How did you get so spot on with those personalities?
Well, honestly, so much of it came because, as much as you said there's a lot out there, I like to think I went to some alternative sources. I can't speak for all the other people that have written, their books, and there's so many of them. But, like I said, it's sort of a fun detective thing, because part of when you're trying to learn, I say this expression about I want to be able to wear an era, meaning I'm reading so much about it, and suddenly you'll be reading something and then there'll be a mention of Karloff at a party, like you're not even looking for him in that moment. So that's where you really start to build perhaps information that maybe other people weren't getting. Again, I know that there are people that have done way more exhaustive research than I have, but for me, it's always finding it in unusual places. One of and particularly with the Laemmles, the story of Carl Laemmle Jr., one of the things I discovered, was their proclivity for throwing parties. They loved to throw parties. And so I'd be reading, any number of memoirs or autobiographies of stars from that period, and suddenly there's a party at the Laemmles. And it's that type of detail that you don't expect. And the same thing happened, Junior would pop up here, and, Lugosi would pop up there, not in a book or anything that was about them. What one source that was really fascinating was the famous gossip columnist Luella Parsons. And she had a daily column and a radio show and all this stuff. And she would just sort of throw one line here and there about different stars. And it was always fascinating when you would get a mention of somebody I was looking for. She seemed to have a particular affection for Junior Laemmle. So that was a great source where, he had, being a young guy running a movie studio, he had a lot of romantic escapades, as you can imagine, that got covered. But she also talked very fondly of him creatively. And so I learned a lot about what was driving him from that was an unusual source, like a gossip column.
Were there any big surprises for you as you did your research where you went, wow, I had no idea?
I think one of the big surprises was just how much work Boris Karloff had done before he became discovered. He gets discovered in his early 40s. And like I said, he had made over 80 movies already. And that's, when I give these talks on the book live, usually that gets a gasp, because they think of him as like, oh, he's discovered in Frankenstein. It's like, no, he had been working in Hollywood for about 10 years, had been acting for 20, and, just an actor trying to get by, and so that was pretty impressive. And also what I also found, about Lugosi that was interesting was alternately, he had sort of had the opposite. He had been acting just as long. He was older, but he'd been acting just as long as Karloff, but he had always been a star. It was amazing. In Hungary, he became a star. Then he ends up in Germany. He becomes a star. And then he comes to America and he becomes a star. And it was just sort of that remarkable thing of becoming a star in 3 different countries, and the last 2 not even in his native language. And so that was something that I didn't realize, that just his proclivity to just find a way to be successful. Like anything, he had some years that were tougher than others. And sadly, later in his life, as we all know, there was some not great stuff. But just the ability against such odds to become a star over and over again. I mean, even before he becomes a star from Dracula, he's on Broadway in Dracula. It's an amazing achievement. So those were kind of the things I learned about them that I didn't really know. And again, Junior Laemmle was endlessly fascinating to me, of being, 21 and running a movie studio. That to me, like I said, was really the launching point of the whole thing.
Now, did you come away from it? I definitely came away from the book with a new appreciation for Bela Lugosi. I'm a fan of Bela Lugosi, but I always thought of him as kind of, he's just pompous, and he's, what a lot of fans think. And I really came away from this going, wow, I felt like I understood him a whole lot more, and I saw sides of him I never saw. Was there, as you did your research, did you find a new appreciation for anyone?
Absolutely. One of the things that, you're always looking for, it's an old thing of saying that, stories aren't what, they're why. And why were these people the way they were? For me, it was finding out why not only did Junior Lemley choose to make these movies against great odds, but why. And Lugosi, I found a lot of things in his past that I don't feel were talked about a lot, like particularly his service in World War I, which I thought was very fascinating, that, he saw combat. He wasn't just, he had quite an adventure there. And I think a lot of that was carried with him that isn't normally thought about, him as a person, that whole World War I experience that he had. That was something. And with Junior, I eventually kind of got, and it's in the book, kind of got a good sense of, at least to me, why he chose to make these movies. And with Karloff, he just fascinates me because he just always seems to just, the personalities of Lugosi and Karloff are so different, where Lugosi, and maybe some of it was the language, because even though Karloff was from the UK, he's still speaking his native language here. Lugosi always seemed a little bit uncomfortable in his skin, a little guarded in interviews. Karloff always seemed very comfortable and just, always seemed to be pleased, at every turn, sort of, oh, you're going to be typecast as Frankenstein. And, he was like perfectly fine with that. I'm working, was kind of his attitude. So those were kind of the discoveries about them, about what made them who they were.
I love it. Now, one of the suspenseful things in the book is the family dynamics for Junior and his family and his father, and all of it leading up to a pivotal poker game. I don't want to give away too much for those who haven't read it, but I did want to ask you. Obviously, your research, with the magazines at the time, helped greatly with, I'm sure, with kind of building that. But how much of that is true, and how much of that did you kind of put together on your own?
No, I mean, it's historical fiction, that there is stuff that I fictionalize scenes, but everything is based as much as possible on fact. And there was, one of the, we sort of haven't touched on it. The reason that Carl Laemmle Jr. ended up in charge of a movie studio is that it was the studio his father, Carl Laemmle Sr., had founded. So that is all true. There was the tension between them. It's funny that you're asking me about that, because I had an event just about a week ago at a museum out here where we had an evening where we celebrated Carl Laemmle Jr. And I did a whole presentation. I did like an hour-long PowerPoint on it. And it was great to celebrate him. But I had family members there, and, some of them who knew Junior later in life, and they were fantastic. But some of them did ask me, like, so was that stuff a little heightened about the tension between them? And no, it wasn't. Every family has a dynamic, and his father did put him in charge of the studio at 21, but they did fight over the direction. The father Carl Laemmle Sr. did not want to make these horror films. He thought it was a terrible idea. Even after Dracula was successful, he thought Frankenstein was insanity. You did it once. We got lucky. It wasn't a flop. You can't do it again. And of course, Frankenstein is even bigger and really launches everything from that. And he admits it later. I sort of end my presentation with this great quote from his father, just basically saying it was all Junior's idea to do these films. Nobody else wanted to do it. So yes, that is based on fact. And even the poker game that you talk about is a famous poker game that went on. That was one of the things that I believe I found after my first draft, and I went, okay, I got to use that, because you had, and I just liked the image of these sort of powerful men, and then suddenly they're playing poker, and there were even stories, I think I even allude to it in there, but true stories of, like, sometimes the debts were settled by, okay, you can have Stanwyck for a picture, that's how so, and I just love that, it's such a great image.
That's so great. Yes, I'm so glad that you found that information and incorporated that in the story, because that was just one of those sweeteners that just made it awesome. Now, some writers start off, sometimes you have like a scene or something that appears in your head and you go, wow, I got to start with this, or I have to make sure this is included. I mean, that might be the moment, but was there any scene that you kind of started with in your head and you went, I want to write a book about this?
Well, it's funny, the way that it began, as I mentioned, I rediscovered the films as an adult. And the first thing I glommed onto, which ended up not having anything to do with the story, which often happens in the process of looking for the story you want to tell, I was first kind of obsessed with that there had been during the classic cycle of the Universal monster movies, there had been 3 different actors to play Frankenstein. Lugosi had done it at one point. Obviously Karloff started it, and then I guess Lon Chaney, and I guess you had Glenn Strange too, even though I was more sort of on those 3. So that's what I started with. That was my initial thing, like, oh, this is interesting. You have this character and they have 3 different interpretations. And the funny thing is I couldn't find a film that those 3 guys were in together. They all are mixed in, but those 3 never did a Universal horror together. The closest being, and it was Abbott Costello Meet Frankenstein, was supposed to be that was the producer's original vision, was he wanted to get, because you have Lugosi as Dracula and you have Chaney as the Wolfman, and he wanted Karloff as Frankenstein, but Karloff wouldn't do it. So I even sort of toyed with that for a bit, and I went, and then I found Junior, and I ended up on that. So that was the initial thing that launched it for me. In terms of a scene, the only thing I can tell you that when I knew I had a story was the first 3 sequences in the book, where I start with Junior, then I go to Lugosi, and then I go to Karloff. Once that laid out in my head, and the way, one of the, like your comment about my stuff, reading fast and you couldn't put it down and that sort of thing, I get that consistently, and I'm very proud of that. And when I came up with those 3, it was the handoff between each scene that made me go, okay, this will work. And that sort of generates it down the line.
Now, without giving too much away, I found the closing of the book to be particularly touching. Did you know from the start that you were going to kind of end that way?
The epilogue or before the epilogue?
I guess just before the epilogue, actually, yes.
Yeah, yes. That was when I sort of, because that goes into the moment of realization of why Junior wanted to make these films and what the moment was that needed to be. Yeah, that was in it pretty early.
Yeah.
That when I sort of realized that that's where it needs to go.
Now, what's next for you? It's going to be very hard to top It's Alive.
Oh, well, thank you. That's nice of you to say. I'm one of those people, unfortunately, there are so many writers I admire who can be simultaneously promoting one and writing another. And I have another one about half written, but I've been so caught up in the last year in promoting this. I've never been good at doing 2 things at once. I have about half written a novel that tells the story of the Apollo space race in the 1960s. That's another big passion of mine. And that's the next one I'm hoping to have finished.
Well, I'm certainly glad that you're enjoying the success of It's Alive and that you're still immersed in that world. It's a great world to be in.
Yes.
I definitely am going to reread the book over the summer again. It's going to be one of my beach or hammock rereads for sure.
Wonderful.
And where can folks check out more information about you and find information about the book?
Sure. There's juliandavidstone.com, my website. You can see, I try to keep it updated with what I'm doing, but there's information about the book. You can buy autographed copies there. The book is also available at Amazon, or you can go to your bookstore and ask for it. It's audio. It's an audio book. It's Kindle, hardcover, everything you want. But the website is a good place to check out. And the nice thing is, I mentioned I did that presentation recently on Junior, and I'm doing it again in a couple of weeks at a horror convention, and I'm hoping to continue doing that because he's got a great story. And this presentation that I put together for the museum out here really went well. And I'm hoping to keep doing that. And it's a great way to sort of tell his story, as he really launches everything. Everything comes out of those first 5. Junior was there until 1936, so the classic cornerstone films, the 5 that really set the tone for the whole cycle, are made directly under his running of the studio. And to me, everything grows out of that, and that's what the presentation is about.
Oh, we'll definitely see that out. Julian, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
We want to thank you for being with us. My name is Ray Schwetz. This is Tower Talk Business Radio, the voice of National Community College, 90.3 WHPC.